Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Richards, and this is my presentation on the National Parks and State Parks of the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to stay focused specifically on Washington State National Parks and State Parks. However, if anyone is interested in the history of the national park system as a whole, I would highly suggest watching the Ken Burns documentary, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. Now, what are national parks, and more importantly, why do they exist? Well, by the late 1800s, the vast majority of wilderness in the eastern and central United States had been cleared, mined, and otherwise commercially damaged. The Pacific Northwest had some of the last true bastions of wilderness in the contiguous United States, and there became a public swelling of support to save some of the greatest features of these wilderness areas. Now, this support was called scenic nationalism. The idea behind it being that where the United States lagged behind Europe in cultural and architectural history, it more than made up for it with the natural land formations that the European continent lacked. The early stages of national park support involved saving places considered aesthetically pleasing, such as Mount Rainier in Washington State or Yosemite in California. Eventually, the national park idea evolved to include concepts of parks as wilderness preserves, such as North Cascades. That did not gain large public support until the 1960s, when Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring kickstarted the modern environmentalist movement. In short, national parks exist to preserve both aesthetically pleasing and environmentally important tracts of land for public enjoyment. Many national parks were originally forest reserves or national forests, to which you might think, well, that land was already protected. But as you will see in the next slide, that wasn't always necessarily the case. Three of the key figures in the national park movement were John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, and Gifford Pinchot. The photo on the left shows Roosevelt and Pinchot, and the photo on the right shows Roosevelt and Muir. You may recognize their names. Camp Muir on Mount Rainier is named after Muir. It is where he chose to set up base camp before summiting Rainier. Gifford Pinchot National Forest extends from just south of Mount Rainier all the way down to past Mount Adams, Carson River Valley, and that is named after Pinchot. Muir and Pinchot were on opposite philosophical sides when it came to conservation of wilderness. Now, both agreed that timberland should not be wholesale cut down and laid waste to, but that was about the extent of their agreement. Muir specifically believed in the preservation of wilderness for the sake of wildness, as he liked to call it. He did not believe the land could be improved upon, nor should it be used as anything other than cathedrals of nature. Many of the early national parks, particularly Yosemite and Sequoia, but Mount Rainier and Crater Lake as well, they exist in no small part due to Muir. Muir believed the wilderness should be protected from logging, animal grazing, mining, and damming, which generally speaking, is what national parks accomplished. Gifford Pinchot, he came from a forestry background, and he was the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. Pinchot believed in a utilization of forests and wilderness for the public good as well as for its economic benefit. He believed the government should manage forests and lease land for controlled logging and other forms of economic use. He famously said, "Wilderness is waste." Because of these competing philosophies, there exists to this day a friction between the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, he's often on the short list of the United States' greatest presidents. And that is in no small part because of his choice to over and over again protect the last remaining wilderness of the United States. He was an outdoorsman. He loved being out in nature. And Pinchot was Roosevelt's primary advisor. Because of this, Pinchot's philosophy, not Muir's, was the primary driver of U.S. conservation practices until the 1960s. There are 6 national parks that could be argued are Pacific Northwest national parks. 4 of those are absolutely Pacific Northwest parks. And the 4 primary parks, Mount Rainier, Olympic, North Cascades, which is actually a park complex, and I will get to that later, and Crater Lake. Crater Lake's in Oregon. I'm not going to really talk about that. But it is a Pacific Northwest park. The 2 others that you could argue are in the Pacific Northwest are Glacier and which is in western Montana, and Yellowstone, which which is in a sliver of Idaho and a sliver of Montana, but it's almost entirely in Washington, or in Wyoming, excuse me. And so I'm going to be focusing on the 3 that are in Washington state. First, we have Mount Rainier National Park. It's one of the earliest created national parks, and as such, it's in many ways a shining example of how to not build a national park. It shows the cultural mindset at the turn of the 20th century of what should be a national park. And while certainly no one is going to argue against Mount Rainier being deemed worthy of national park status, if you look at its boundaries, they're incredibly small. Essentially, the park is just the mountain. Very little of its forests and 5 watersheds are preserved. And this is because the forests at the turn of the century were still considered more important as a commercially valuable entity than as a wilderness to preserve. To add them to a national park, would inhibit their future economic value. It proved the influence at the time of materialism over preservation. Now, in an interesting bit of history, our old pals from Unit 6, the Northern Pacific Railroad, were largely responsible for the creation of the park. The Northern Pacific had land grant rights to much of Mount Rainier, which Northern Pacific, Mount Rainier being a giant volcano, they considered those land grants useless land. So when Mount Rainier became a national park, Northern Pacific was able to trade that useless land for an equivalent amount of land elsewhere, where it just so happened to be uncut timberland, mostly in southwest Oregon. By backing the creation of the national park and helping to write the bill, Northern Pacific Railroad indirectly made quite a bit of profit. Olympic National Park covers a large swath of the Washington State Peninsula and Pacific Coast, and it was established on June 29, 1938, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's 5th cousin. Now, before Olympic became a national park, it was a national monument. It covered a much smaller portion of land and had fewer protections, but it was a national monument for about 30 years before it was a national park, and before that, it was the largest forest reserve in the nation. Forest Service did not want Olympic to become a national park because, the proposed boundaries included commercially valuable timberland. They did not want that land to be part of a national park, and they used the argument that, that timberland is not national park caliber. Well, the preservationists made the case that, hey, the primary feature of Olympic is the rainforest. It inherently required the timberland to be preserved. So FDR himself visited Olympic in 1937, and after visiting, he made the decision that the future park should, in fact, include all that timberland, all of the Olympic watersheds, and it's vastly different from Mount Rainier's protection. And between 1941 and 1958, after it became a park, it was still illegally forested, at times with help from the superintendent of the park himself, using salvage contracts, which deemed that any tree which may potentially be infested with insects could be logged. Well, as you can imagine, many trees suddenly had the potential to be infested with insects. Once the public finally caught on, there was quite an outcry, and that practice was put to a halt. It just goes to show that just because land becomes a national park does not become immune to damage from humans. North Cascades National Park was established on October 2nd, 1968, and as you can see in the title, it's technically a national park complex. Well, what does that mean? North Cascades is split up into 4 separate sections. There's the northern section. It goes from the Skagit River north to the Canadian border, and this is all east of Mount Baker. Mount Baker is not part of the national park. The southern section of the park runs from the Skagit River south to, generally speaking, east of Glacier Peak. Glacier Peak is not part of the national park. And the southern section's borders are much more jagged than the northern section. They run southeasterly rather than due south. Now that's the park itself. And if you only include the annual attendance to that section of the park, it is one of the least visited parks in the nation. Only 40,000 or so people per year travel to the main park. And in the wintertime, literally a dozen or less people. Well, why? Because it's pure wilderness, very difficult climbing, steep valleys, forests all the way around, little in the way of general recreation. Now, there are two other sections of the park complex, the Ross Lake National Recreation Area and Lake Chelan National Recreation Area. And when people visit North Cascades, this is where they're usually going. Ross Lake is right off of State Route 20, the North Cascades Highway, and Lake Chelan is one of the more popular summer destinations in the entire state. There was actually a bit of an outcry by preservationists when Ross Lake and its companion Diablo Lake were initially added to the park boundary itself, not a recreation area, but a park. And that was because those lakes are dammed reservoirs. They're not true lakes. And the preservationists, by and large, do not believe in damming in national parks. Well, Seattle City Light owned the dams, and without their support, North Cascades probably would not have been created at all. So that became part of the recreation area. And this is just another example of business interests helping to create a national park. Now, why are Ross Lake and Lake Chelan national recreation areas instead of parks themselves? Well, I just mentioned with Ross and Diablo Lake, the damming aspect of it, but also Chelan and Ross Lake were very popular fishing destinations prior to the creation of the park. If those lakes and reservoirs had been in the park boundary, it would have made it very legally speaking difficult to restock fish in those popular fishing lakes. The reservoirs have no natural restocking, and even though Lake Chelan itself is not a reservoir, it's a true lake. There's a dam that was built that rose the lake by about 20 feet, and it also inhibited natural restocking. And so by making those lakes recreation areas, it allowed for the state to have an easier time to restock fish in those lakes, legally speaking. Now we're at, finally, the Washington State Parks. Washington State has over 140 state parks currently. I counted 142, including marine state parks, on the Washington State Parks website. They do not actually list an official number. They only state over 140. Well, there you go. The first state park, Larrabee State Park near Bellingham, was established in 1915 and came directly from land and money donated by a man named C.X. Larrabee. This is in fact how most of the early state parks were established. The state park movement itself was tied to efforts to save roadside beauty or roadside timber, as park supporters such as Sahel Curtis, I think that's how you say his name, and Herbert Evison called it. That is why many state parks are on or near major roadways in the state. The state leadership was for decades very hesitant to create any state parks. For example, Robert Morin owned the land and had the money to create a state park on Orcas Island. But even though he wanted to donate the land, he had the money and he had much public backing. It took nearly a decade before they could convince the state. Curtis helped convince the state to allow for the creation of Morin State Park. In the 1960s, again, post-Silent Spring, and under the leadership of Governor Albert Rossellini and Charles H. Odegaard, the state park system began to grow substantially. Rossellini was the first governor in our state to really see the economic benefit of state parks to both tourism and to local Washingtonians who wanted to visit the outdoors and use it as recreation areas. State park creation slowed again in the early 80s, late 70s, around the time Dixie Lee Ray became the governor. And in fact, Washington's first state park in nearly 40 years, Nisqually State Park, is going to be open theoretically in the summer of 2025. I hope it opens. I would love to go and visit it. That is my report. Ran a little long, as you can see, but I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great summer. Have a great rest of the school year. Here's my works cited page. And yeah, have a good one, everyone.